The room went so quiet I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the Carlisle dining room. 20 years of Navy discipline had trained me to notice silence. Real silence. The kind that presses against your skin and tells you something has shifted. My fiancé's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. His younger brother Julian stared at me like I'd just stood up and recited state secrets. Across the polished mahogany table, Eleanor Carlisle slowly lowered her fork onto her china plate with the kind of precision only old money women seem to master. And Ethan? Ethan looked at me the way men look at a locked door they were certain would open. A moment earlier he'd leaned toward Julian with that smug little half-smile of his and murmured in Latin, "Non intelligis, tantum ridea et annua." She has no clue, just smile and nod. The table had chuckled softly. I had smiled politely. Then I'd lifted my crystal glass, met Ethan's eyes, and answered in the same measured Latin my Georgetown professor once called better than his own. Intellego satis, etiam superbiam tuum. I understand enough, including your arrogance. That was the moment his family froze. And that was the moment I finally understood I was not going to marry Ethan Carlisle. 3 hours earlier I had believed I was driving toward my future. The late October sun had cast long amber streaks across Route 50 as I headed toward Annapolis, the Chesapeake flashing silver through the trees. Maryland always looked dignified in autumn, like it understood its own history. Ethan had texted twice while I drove. "Mom's gone overboard as usual. Just smile and survive." Then, "Don't let Julian bait you. He thinks he's Cicero reincarnated." I smiled at that. At the time I thought it was affectionate. I should have known better. Ethan and I had been engaged for 6 months. We'd met 3 years earlier at a policy conference in Arlington, where I'd been speaking on strategic intelligence reform, and he'd been moderating a panel on constitutional litigation. He was handsome in the polished Georgetown way, tailored suits, expensive watches, that dark blonde hair, always just imperfect enough to look accidental. He had a quick wit and the kind of confidence that made people assume depth. At 45, he'd never married. His friends described him as discerning. When we met, he told people I was the most fascinating woman he'd ever known. I believed him. That was my mistake. I'm Claire Bennett, 42, retired Navy intelligence officer now teaching strategic military history at St. John's College in Annapolis. Officially, I spent 19 years specializing in linguistic analysis and operational coordination. Unofficially, there are things I still can't discuss. People hear Navy intelligence and imagine fluorescent offices and secure conference calls. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes it wasn't. What mattered was this: the work taught me to read people the way other women read novels. And somehow with Ethan I'd missed the ending. The Carlisle estate sat on 17 waterfront acres just outside town. White columns, perfect hedges, gravel driveway that whispered beneath your tires. The kind of house designed to remind visitors they were guests. I parked beside Ethan's silver Mercedes and checked my reflection in the mirror. Simple navy sheath dress, pearl earrings, hair pinned neatly back. Composed. The woman looking back at me had survived Kabul, Brussels, and 3 weeks in a Romanian safe house during a diplomatic breach. Surely she could survive dinner with future in-laws. Ethan opened the front door before I reached it. "There she is," he said, kissing my cheek. He smelled like cedar and old bourbon. "You look tense." "I'm fine." He studied me for half a second. "You know, my mother can smell anxiety." I laughed softly. "Good thing I don't have any." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Inside the house glowed with old money warmth. Oil paintings, brass sconces, Persian rugs softened by generations of footsteps. Everything immaculate. Everything careful. Eleanor Carlisle greeted me with cool elegance. "Claire, lovely dress." "Not you look lovely." The dress did. Richard Carlisle appeared moments later, broad-shouldered despite his 74 years. His handshake was warm, direct. "Good to see you again, Claire." He was the only member of Ethan's family who ever looked people fully in the eye. Then came Julian. 40, smug, recently divorced, and still somehow convinced prep school rowing victories counted as adult accomplishments. "Well," he said, kissing the air near my cheek, "our mystery woman returns." I smiled. Still mysterious after all this time. Some women improve with ambiguity. Ethan chuckled. Everyone chuckled. I smiled politely. That phrase would come to define the evening. Cocktails were served in the library. Julian and Ethan drifted naturally into Latin, tossing phrases back and forth like tennis volleys. It didn't surprise me. Elite East Coast boys often collect dead languages the way Texans collect hunting rifles. Display pieces. Julian quoted Horace badly. Ethan corrected him. I said nothing. At one point, Richard glanced at me curiously, but I only smiled. Let them perform. Dinner was served at 8 sharp. The dining room overlooked the bay moonlight silvering the black water beyond tall windows. Eleanor had seated me between Ethan and Richard. Conversation stayed pleasantly shallow: politics, university funding, local preservation projects. Then Julian mentioned classical education. Ethan smirked. And in Latin low enough to seem private but loud enough for the table to hear, he said, Non intelligi, tantum ridea et annua. Soft laughter followed. I turned my wineglass slowly between my fingers. For one strange second, I saw my 20-year-old self in a Georgetown lecture hall, Professor Moretti pacing before us, insisting that language was never about words. It was about power. Who assumes understanding? Who withholds it? Who reveals it? So I lifted my eyes to Ethan and answered, Intellego satis, etiam superbium tuam. The silence that followed was exquisite. And in Ethan's face I saw something crack. Not embarrassment. Recognition. For the first time since we met, he realized he had no idea who I really was. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But in families like the Carlyles, where every pause carried generations of practiced meaning, a few seconds could feel like a verdict. Ethan recovered first. He laughed. Too quickly. Too brightly. Well, he said, clearing his throat, that's one way to make an impression. No one joined him. Julian's face had gone oddly pale beneath his summer tan. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again as though he'd forgotten what expression he meant to wear. Across the table, Eleanor Carlyle sat unnaturally still, one elegant hand resting against the stem of her wineglass. Her blue eyes had sharpened with sudden interest. And Richard? Richard Carlyle was studying me the way intelligence officers study satellite photos after receiving unexpected confirmation. Quietly. Carefully. Reassessing everything. Then in measured formal Latin he asked, Ubi didicisti? Where did you learn? The question was flawless. Not the ornamental Latin of prep school men performing sophistication over cocktails, not memorized fragments dusted off to impress dinner guests. This was living academic Latin, precise and economical. For the first time all evening I felt genuine curiosity. I answered without hesitation. Apud Georgetownensem universitatem, sed amor linguae multo antequepit. At Georgetown University, but my love for the language began long before. Richard inclined his head. Approval flickered in his eyes. Julian shifted in his chair. Dad, really? Richard ignored him. Still in Latin, he asked, and before Georgetown. I smiled. Akron Public Schools, a stubborn librarian and a second-hand copy of Cicero. That got his attention. Not because Akron was impressive. Because it wasn't. Old families like the Carlyles understand pedigree, they rarely understand effort. For the first time that evening, Richard smiled. A self-made classicist. I answered with a line from Cicero itself. Nescire autem quid antequam natus sis accideritid est semper esse puerum. To be ignorant of what came before your birth is to remain forever a child. A small sound escaped Eleanor. Not laughter. Recognition. She knew enough Latin to understand what had just happened. And more importantly, she understood that I had won. Not cruelly. Not theatrically. Simply by being exactly who I had always been. The rest of dinner stumbled forward on uncertain legs. English returned to the table, but awkwardly now, like guests arriving late to a gathering already changed. Julian withdrew into sullen silence. Eleanor redirected conversation toward neutral territory, charitable boards, local politics, the upcoming Naval Academy Gala. Ethan became aggressively charming. He laughed too much, refilled glasses, too often interrupted people mid-sentence. To anyone who didn't know him well, he would have seemed perfectly at ease. But I knew Ethan, and I could see panic behind the polish. He kept glancing at me, searching for something. Anger, maybe? Vindication. A sign I intended to humiliate him further. Instead, I remained calm. That unsettled him most of all. Because Ethan had always believed emotional control was his gift. He had never realized mine ran deeper. As dessert arrived, a pecan tart Eleanor insisted came from a bakery in Georgetown. Despite tasting suspiciously homemade, I found myself drifting backward through memory. Back to Ohio. To winter. To the little brick library on Maple Avenue where Mrs. Callahan had first placed a worn Latin primer in my hands. I was 14 and hungry for somewhere else. Not physically hungry, though there'd been years when money was tight enough for that, too. Hungry in the way bright children often are when they grow up in places too small for their questions. My father worked maintenance at Goodyear. My mother taught 3rd grade. Good people, honest people. But they lived practical lives, and practical lives have little use for dead languages. Mrs. Callahan had noticed me lingering near the classics shelf after school. "You look like a girl who wants answers," she'd said. Then she handed me Cicero. That was all it took. Language became escape first. Then discipline. Then identity. At Georgetown, professors assumed I came from old East Coast schools because my Latin was stronger than theirs. I never corrected them unless necessary. People reveal themselves through assumptions. That lesson later served me well in naval intelligence. And eventually it brought me to Ethan. We met in Arlington after my keynote on multinational intelligence coordination. He approached afterward smiling that polished smile. "You speak like someone who's forgotten more than I'll ever know." I laughed. He seemed sincere. For a while he was, or perhaps he only loved what he imagined I represented. Composure. Mystery. Competence that reflected well on him. It happens. Some men don't fall in love with women. They fall in love with possessing exceptional women. And the moment those women become fully human, complex, unknowable, independently formidable, the affection curdles into competition. I didn't know that yet. Not fully. But some part of me was beginning to understand. After dessert, Eleanor suggested coffee in the library. The room shifted there with visible relief. Safe ground. Bookshelves, leather chairs inherited authority. The Carlyles understood libraries better than dining tables after social defeat. As we settled near the fire, Richard approached me quietly. "Walk with me a moment." Ethan stiffened. I noticed. So did Richard. He said nothing. We stepped into the hallway where the low amber light softened the oil portraits watching from paneled walls. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Richard said, "You spent time in government service." Not a question. I met his gaze. Yes. He nodded once. I served naval intelligence from 1973 to 1981. That surprised me. He gave a faint smile. You carry it the same way. Years of classified work train posture differently than civilian life ever could. Alertness settles into the bones. Most people never notice. Richard had. He studied me carefully. My son doesn't know who he's engaged to, does he? The honesty of it caught me off guard. I could have deflected. Instead, I answered truthfully. No, I don't believe he does. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. That may be my greatest failure as a father. And for reasons I couldn't yet name, those words unsettled me far more than Ethan's insult ever had. Because for the first time all evening, someone in that house had spoken without performance. And it made me wonder whether I'd mistaken the wrong person for the Carlyle worth knowing. Richard's words followed me long after he returned to the library. That may be my greatest failure as a father. There had been no bitterness in his voice. No dramatic regret. Just the flat, honest weight of a man finally saying aloud something he'd understood for years and hoped might somehow correct itself if left unspoken. That kind of truth tends to linger. I stood alone in the hallway for another moment, listening to the distant murmur of voices drifting from the library. Laughter floated out a second later. Ethan's laughter. Easy, smooth, recovering. By the time I walked back in, his public face had been fully restored. He sat near the fireplace, one ankle crossed over his knee, smiling as Julian stumbled through some story about a disastrous sailing weekend in Newport. Eleanor was politely amused. Richard was listening with that patient expression fathers wear when their sons have grown old enough to disappoint them elegantly. Ethan glanced up as I entered. His smile widened half a shade. Ownership disguised as affection. There she is. I smiled and sat beside him. He placed a proprietary hand against the small of my back. Anyone watching would have seen intimacy. What I felt was positioning. And for the first time I noticed how often he did it. At conferences, charity dinners, faculty receptions, that subtle guiding pressure as though he were helping me navigate rooms I had crossed far more dangerous than he could imagine. At the time I had mistaken it for tenderness. But tenderness does not steer. It steadies. The distinction arrived quietly like so many important realizations do. Coffee was served. Conversation drifted toward the upcoming wedding. Eleanor had opinions about flowers. Julian had opinions about venue security, though he'd never organized anything more complex than a yacht club fundraiser. Ethan had opinions about everything. I sat there smiling politely, and beneath that calm surface something old and well-trained had begun taking inventory. In intelligence work, you learn to trust discomfort. Not panic. Not fear. Discomfort is quieter. It simply notes inconsistency. A smile held half a second too long. A phrase repeated too often. A pattern finally visible because enough small details have aligned. For months, perhaps years, I had filed Ethan's behavior under harmless categories. Confidence. Privilege. Social habit. Tonight those files were being reclassified. And once reclassification happens, you cannot unknow what you know. Around 10:30 the evening ended. Eleanor kissed my cheek with measured grace. Drive safely, Claire. Not warm. Not cold. But different. Something had shifted. Julian avoided eye contact altogether. Richard shook my hand and held it briefly. A soldier's handshake. Respect offered without display. Then Ethan walked me to my car beneath the sharp autumn stars. The gravel crunched under our shoes. The bay beyond the trees was black and still. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he gave a short laugh. Well, that was dramatic. I turned to face him. The porch light cast hard lines across his face, sharpening him into someone I suddenly realized I had never fully seen. Was it? Oh, come on, Claire. He smiled, but tension pinched the edges of it. You blindsided everyone. I answered a sentence spoken about me at my own dinner table. His expression tightened. It was a joke. Was it? That irritated him. Not the question itself, the calmness with which I asked it. Ethan had always done well against visible emotion. Anger he could charm, tears he could soothe, frustration he could out-argue. Stillness unsettled him. It was family teasing, he said. You know how people are. No, I said quietly. I know how your family is. His jaw flexed. There it was. The first crack. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though intimacy could disguise control. You embarrassed me tonight. I let that settle between us. Not, I'm sorry if I hurt you. Not, I didn't realize that would upset you. Not even we embarrassed each other. Just, you embarrassed me. At last the truth standing in plain sight. I felt no anger. Only clarity. That seems to be the part upsetting you most. His eyes hardened. You're being sensitive. I almost smiled. There are certain phrases men use when they feel power slipping. You're overreacting. You misunderstood. You're too emotional. They're all variations of the same plea. Please return to the smaller version of yourself I was comfortable with. Years earlier in Brussels, a senior NATO liaison had tried something similar after underestimating my operational recommendations. He'd dismissed my analysis as perhaps overly intuitive. 3 weeks later, my assessment prevented a catastrophic intelligence leak. He apologized in private. Not because he'd changed. Because reality had cornered him. Ethan wasn't there yet. Maybe he never would be. I'm tired, I said. His expression softened instantly, relief flooding in. He thought retreat meant surrender. He kissed my forehead. That's all this is, long week, too much tension. I nodded once. Good night, Ethan. He smiled, reassured. See you Wednesday. Of course. Another mistake he made. Assuming calm agreement meant restored harmony. I drove back toward Annapolis beneath a cold, clear sky, the radio off the Chesapeake gleaming faintly to my right. The drive should have felt familiar. Instead, every mile felt like crossing invisible borders. When I reached my townhouse near campus, I poured a small bourbon and sat in the dark living room without turning on a light. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. My engagement ring caught the moonlight. Simple platinum, elegant, expensive enough to reassure old families. I turned it slowly around my finger, and one by one memories surfaced. Ethan correcting my pronunciation of a French wine region I had literally visited on assignment. Ethan interrupting one of my lectures to clarify context for guests. Ethan joking to friends that I was brilliant but socially feral. Each moment small enough to dismiss, together unmistakable. The pattern was complete. And once a pattern completes, action follows. I removed the ring, held it in my palm, then slipped it into my purse. Not dramatically, not tearfully. Simply as one files a report after reaching unavoidable conclusions. I slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep that comes only after certainty. And when I woke before dawn, I already knew my future had changed. I just hadn't yet decided how to tell Ethan. The strange thing about certainty is how peaceful it feels. People imagine the end of an engagement as slammed doors, raised voices, shattered glasses, and dramatic midnight declarations. But real endings, especially the important ones, usually arrive quietly. They settle into the room and wait for you to notice them. The week after dinner at the Carlisle estate unfolded with almost insulting normalcy. I taught my classes at St. John's. I graded midterm essays on Clausewitz and strategic restraint. I met colleagues for coffee. I walked the old brick paths beneath the yellowing sycamores and listened to the bells from the chapel tower drift over campus like memory itself. And every morning I woke with the same calm knowledge. I was not going to marry Ethan Carlisle. I still hadn't told him. That wasn't hesitation. It was timing. Years in intelligence work teach patience. You don't act because emotion demands it. You act when conditions are right. And conditions, as it happened, were about to become ideal. Wednesday evening, Ethan called. His voice was bright, polished, affectionate. Good news. I was at my kitchen counter chopping rosemary for roast chicken. What kind of good news? Mother insisted we move the engagement party up. I paused. The engagement party had originally been scheduled for December after Thanksgiving. Why? She thinks momentum matters. That sounded exactly like Eleanor Carlisle. Appearances first, reflection later. When? Saturday, Georgetown Club, black tie. 3 days away. Conveniently impossible to decline without explanation. I smiled faintly. Perfect. That's sudden. I know, but it'll be wonderful. Everyone important will be there. Everyone important. Not everyone loved. Not everyone close to us. Important. The word landed exactly as he intended. Status disguised as celebration. When were you planning to tell me? I asked. A pause. Then that easy laugh. Oh, Claire, don't do that. Do what? Notice. Question. Exist independently of his assumptions. He softened his voice. You'll look beautiful. My mother's handling details. Just show up and let yourself be adored. There it was again. That subtle positioning. Smile and nod. The phrase echoed through my mind with almost comic precision. And for the first time I felt something dangerously close to amusement. Of course, I said. He exhaled, reassured. Wonderful, I'll pick you up at 7. After we hung up, I finished preparing dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat alone at my dining table. The townhouse was warm and quiet. Outside leaves scraped softly along the sidewalk in the wind. I thought about calling Ethan then and ending it cleanly. Simple, civilized. But another thought arrived just as quickly. No, not revenge. Not humiliation. Just truth placed where it could no longer be ignored. If Ethan wanted an audience for performance, then perhaps the audience deserved honesty. Saturday arrived crisp and cold. By 6:30, Georgetown was glowing under soft amber street lamps, the old brick facades polished by generations of wealth and expectation. I stood before my bedroom mirror fastening pearl earrings. My dress was midnight blue silk, understated and severe enough to command attention without asking for it. The kind of elegance that doesn't need approval. I left my engagement ring in the velvet box on my dresser. Intentional. Not forgotten. At exactly 7, Ethan knocked. When I opened the door, his smile faltered. "You're not wearing it." I held his gaze. "No." A beat passed. Then he smiled again, tighter this time. "Well, we'll fix that before photos." I said nothing. He mistook silence for compliance. Again. The Georgetown Club was everything one expects from old Washington. Money-polished walnut paneling, crystal chandeliers, discreetly expensive floral arrangements, staff who moved like choreography. The ballroom hummed with practiced prestige. Federal judges, lobbyists, professors, retired admirals, women in silk and diamonds discussing foundations they only half remembered funding, men who still introduced themselves by former titles. The Carlisle world. And tonight I was meant to become part of it. Eleanor greeted us with air kisses and visible relief. "Claire, darling, there you are." Her eyes dropped instantly to my bare hand. A fractional pause. Then composure returned. Professional grade recovery. Lovely dress. Again, the dress received what I did not. Richard appeared moments later. His expression flicked once to my empty ring finger. Understanding settled quietly in his eyes. He said nothing. But he knew. And somehow that steadied me. The evening unfolded exactly as planned. Champagne circulated. Guests praised our future. Ethan played the attentive fiancé with polished precision. His hand rested lightly at my waist. His smile dazzled. His voice carried warmth calibrated to perfection. And all the while I watched him the way I once watched foreign dignitaries during classified negotiations, noting where performance strained against truth. At 9 sharp, Eleanor tapped her crystal flute for attention. The room quieted. She smiled toward Ethan. Our son would like to say a few words. Applause followed. Ethan stepped onto the low platform near the grand piano. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. Perfect confidence. He lifted his champagne glass. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate this extraordinary woman." The crowd smiled approvingly. He looked directly at me. And then I saw it. That glint. The same one he'd worn at dinner before speaking Latin. Performance sharpened by cruelty. "My Claire," he said warmly, "remains the most mysterious person I've ever known." Polite laughter. "She's brilliant, of course, though often in ways difficult to decode." More laughter. A gentle joke. Harmless enough. Then he switched to Latin. Confidently. Smoothly. And incorrectly. He intended. Even silence can conceal confusion. What he actually said, thanks to a badly declined participle, translated closer to. Even silence confuses itself while hiding. The room, of course, didn't know. But I did. And Richard did. And for one suspended second our eyes met across the ballroom. He gave the slightest nod. Permission. Or perhaps acknowledgement. Either way I understood. So before Ethan could continue, I stepped forward. And in clear, elegant Latin heard across the suddenly still room, I said, "You've declined the participle incorrectly." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Ethan froze. I continued still in flawless Latin. "If one wishes to insult a woman publicly, precision helps." A few guests laughed nervously. Then Richard laughed outright. The sound cracked the room open. And Ethan's perfect evening began to collapse. For half a second after Richard laughed, no one else moved. It was the kind of moment Washington society secretly lives for. Not charity galas. Not policy dinners. Not elegant speeches about duty and service. No. What people in rooms like that truly crave is rupture. The instant polished certainty breaks open and reveals whatever trembling truth has been hiding underneath. And there, under the crystal chandeliers of the Georgetown Club, Ethan Carlisle was trembling. His smile remained in place, but it had become mechanical now, like a light left burning in an empty house. He looked at me as though he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing. Not because I had corrected his Latin, because I had done it calmly, without anger, without apology, and without needing anyone's permission. The crowd shifted uneasily, their instincts splitting in 2 directions. One half wanted to pretend nothing unusual had happened. The other half wanted front-row seats. Washington is full of cowards and spectators. Often the same people. Ethan recovered quickly, too quickly. That had always been his gift. He laughed and spread his hands. Well, he said, his voice smooth but brittle at the edges. There you have it. Proof I should never attempt classics in front of Claire. Scattered laughter answered. The room was offering him escape. A lesser humiliation. A chance to reframe this as charming banter. For a brief moment I considered letting him have it. Ending things quietly afterward. No scene. No public reckoning.
That would have been easier.
Kinder, perhaps. Then he looked directly at me and said, "That's what makes her so fascinating. Brilliant, inscrutable. Occasionally difficult to keep up with socially, but intellectually impossible to fault." More laughter. Soft. Encouraging. And there it was. The same move he had always made. Dressed down cruelty as sophistication. Mockery wrapped in polished affection. Invite the room to smile along. I realized then that if I walked away quietly, he would spend the rest of his life telling this story as evidence of my coldness, my mystery, my impossible standards. And people would believe him. Not because he was right, because he was practiced. So I smiled, and stepped fully onto the platform beside him. The room stilled again. Ethan's expression flickered. Just briefly. He hadn't expected movement. I took the microphone gently from his hand. He let go because refusing would have looked absurd. Then I turned to the crowd. Nearly 200 faces watched beneath warm chandelier light. Judges. Professors. Old family friends. Military officers. The kind of Americans who had spent their lives believing dignity meant never raising one's voice. Good. So had I. My fiancé is right about one thing, I said. My voice carried evenly through the ballroom. I am difficult to decode. A ripple of polite laughter. I smiled faintly. That happens when someone spends 19 years in naval intelligence. The laughter stopped. A murmur moved through the room. I saw several retired officers straighten instinctively. Until that moment, Ethan had never told most of them what I had done. He had always described my career vaguely. Government consulting. Strategic analysis. Academic work. Things that sounded impressive but abstract. Nothing that might require him to share the spotlight. I continued. My work required discretion, precision, listening carefully enough to hear what people reveal when they assume you cannot understand them. Now no one moved at all. Across the room, Richard Carlyle stood perfectly still. Not surprised. Proud. And for reasons I would only understand later that mattered. I turned toward Ethan. He had gone pale. There was no anger in his face now. Only fear. Not fear of me. Fear of exposure. The fear all carefully constructed men carry. The terror that one day someone will speak plainly. So I did. When Ethan and I first met, I admired his intelligence, his confidence, his ambition. My eyes stayed on his. I thought those qualities reflected character. Silence. His throat moved. He knew what was coming. But there are moments when consequence arrives too late to negotiate with. Instead, I said gently, I've learned confidence without humility becomes contempt. Intelligence without kindness becomes performance. No one breathed. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. I reached into my evening clutch, removed the platinum ring, held it between my fingers. A small object. A heavy truth. Ethan whispered Claire. Not loud enough for the room. Just for me. A plea. But not the right one. Not I'm sorry. Not I understand. Only, please don't. And after everything, that was what made my choice easiest. I placed the ring carefully on the silver champagne tray nearest the stage. The soft metallic click echoed through the ballroom. Then I looked at him one final time. You once told your brother I should smile and nod. His face drained of all color. A visible tremor passed through him. Gasps fluttered through the room as understanding spread. I smiled not cruelly but honestly. You were half right. I set down the microphone and walked away. No one tried to stop me? Not Ethan. Not Eleanor. Not Julian. Only Richard moved. As I passed, he touched my arm lightly. A soldier's gesture. Respect. Nothing more. Outside, Georgetown's cold night air struck my face like baptism. The street glowed amber beneath old lamps. Cars moved quietly past on Wisconsin Avenue. Life continuing indifferent and immense. For the first time in years, I could breathe without calculation. I stood there for several moments looking up at the dark Washington sky. Then I laughed. Softly. Not from triumph. From relief. There is a profound peace that arrives when performance finally ends. I drove home through the sleeping city with the windows cracked to let in the November cold. No music. No tears. Just stillness. When I reached Annapolis after midnight, I poured bourbon into my father's old glass tumbler and sat by the window overlooking campus. The chapel bell struck 1. And for the first time since accepting Ethan's proposal, I felt entirely like myself. The phone began ringing at 7:12 the next morning. I let it ring. At 7:14 it rang again. At 7:18 my doorbell sounded. And somehow before I even rose from my chair, I already knew it wasn't Ethan. It was Richard. Richard Carlisle stood on my front porch wearing a navy wool overcoat and holding a white bakery box tied with simple string. For a man who had likely spent decades entering rooms from positions of unquestioned authority, he looked unexpectedly uncertain. Not weak. Not ashamed. Just careful. The kind of careful that comes when a person finally understands the importance of getting something right. When I opened the door, he gave a slight nod. Claire. Richard. He lifted the box a little. Blueberry scones from Lighthouse Bistro. I'm told apologies should never arrive empty-handed. For the first time since the engagement party, I smiled. A real smile. Well, I said, stepping aside, that's certainly better than flowers. His mouth twitched. Flowers are often just expensive evasions. I liked him more for saying it. He entered quietly, pausing just inside the foyer to glance around. My townhouse was modest by Carlisle standards, brick narrow overlooking the old streets near St. John's, but warm. Books lined nearly every wall. Framed maps from naval operations I was legally allowed to display hung above the fireplace. The furniture was practical and worn in ways that suggested use rather than curation. Nothing had been selected to impress anyone. That alone probably made it alien to him. I led him to the kitchen. The late morning sun poured through the windows, catching the steam rising from the coffee I'd just made. He set down the pastry box and removed his coat. For a while we moved through the familiar choreography of civility, pouring coffee-setting plates, making small observations about weather and traffic. Older people understand this dance better than younger ones. Sometimes practical motions allow truth to gather courage. At last Richard folded his hands around his coffee cup and looked at me directly. I came to apologize. You already did. Not sufficiently. Fair enough. I waited. He drew a slow breath. I spent years teaching Ethan how to succeed. Schools, connections, discipline, presentation. His mouth tightened faintly. I neglected to teach him humility because I assumed life would do it for me. The honesty of it struck harder than any polished apology could have. There was no self-protection in his tone. No attempt to lessen responsibility. Just truth. I leaned back in my chair. That's rare. He gave me a tired smile. At 74, one grows too old for decorative lies. We sat in silence for a moment. Comfortable silence. Then he said he was here at dawn. That surprised me. At the estate. He nodded. He looked like he hadn't slept. I said nothing. Richard's expression softened, not with pity for his son, but recognition. He asked whether I thought you'd overreacted. I almost laughed. What did you tell him? His eyes held mine. I told him no woman with your bearing overreacts, she observes. Then she acts once she's certain. The words landed deeper than I expected. Because he understood. Not just what had happened. Who I was. Recognition is a rare form of respect. And perhaps the most valuable. He was angry, I asked. At first. Richard took a sip of coffee. Then defensive, then ashamed. He set down the cup carefully. Eventually he cried. That startled me more than anything else. Not because Ethan was incapable of emotion. Because he had always treated vulnerable emotion as failure. Richard saw my surprise. He hasn't cried since he was 14. What changed? He gave a sad smile. For the first time, there was no one left willing to tell him he was right. The kitchen fell quiet again. Outside, dry leaves skittered across the sidewalk. A church bell sounded faintly from downtown Annapolis. Life moving steadily forward. Richard looked around the room. He underestimated you because I taught him to admire polish over substance. I considered that. It was partly true. But not all of it. No, I said gently. You taught him many things. He chose which lessons to keep. Richard absorbed that without flinching. Another mark of character. Finally, he nodded. Yes, that's true. We spoke for nearly 3 hours after that. Not about Ethan mostly. About service. About discipline. About the strange loneliness of leadership. He told me stories from naval intelligence during the late 70s, Moscow analyses, Mediterranean operations, tense Cold War briefings, where one misunderstood sentence might alter history. I told him what little I safely could about my own years overseas. Enough for shared understanding. Not enough to violate trust. And gradually something remarkable happened. The father of the man I had nearly married became simply Richard. An aging officer reckoning honestly with his life. By noon, the sunlight had shifted pale and cool across the kitchen tiles. He stood to leave. At the door, he hesitated. Then he said quietly, "For what it's worth, Claire, I would have been proud to call you family." The words caught me off guard, because they held no manipulation, no implied regret. Only truth offered too late for use, but still worth saying. I smiled. That means more than you know. He nodded once. Then he left. For several moments after the door closed, I stood there in the stillness he left behind. Not grieving, not relieved, simply thoughtful. Some endings leave bitterness. This one had left understanding. That afternoon, I walked across campus beneath a cold, bright sky, hands in my coat pockets, watching students hurry between classes with their scarves flying behind them. The world felt sharper somehow. Cleaner. As though some long-fogged window had finally cleared. And then as I turned onto King George Street, I saw Ethan standing beside my car. Waiting. No polished smile. No tailored confidence. Just a tired man in yesterday's suit staring down at fallen leaves gathering near the curb. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. And in that single glance, I knew this would be the first honest conversation we had ever had. Ethan looked older than he had 3 days earlier. Not dramatically older. Not gray-haired overnight or hollowed by some theatrical collapse. Just worn in the way people look when certainty has finally abandoned them. His tie was gone. His collar stood open and slightly wrinkled. There were dark half-moons beneath his eyes, and for once his hair was not carefully arranged into that studied imperfection he'd spent years mastering. He looked, I realized, like a man who had stopped rehearsing. For reasons I couldn't entirely explain, that made what followed easier. He gave a small nod. Claire. Ethan. Neither of us moved closer. Students passed behind us, laughing softly, backpacks slung over their shoulders, wrapped in scarves against the cold. Somewhere across campus, chapel bells marked the quarter hour. Ordinary life moving around extraordinary endings. It felt right. He glanced down for a moment, then back up. My father was here this morning. He told me. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. I imagine he was kinder to you than he was to me. I said nothing. He looked at the brick sidewalk between us. He said, I've spent my whole life confusing admiration with love. The honesty of that surprised me. Not because it wasn't true. Because Ethan was saying it aloud. There was no audience here. No social leverage to recover. No polished crowd to perform for. Just two people standing under a cold Annapolis sky finally speaking plainly. That must have been difficult to hear, I said. He smiled faintly. It was worse hearing that he was right. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he looked at me fully. Not appraising. Not persuading. Simply looking. And for the first time since I'd known him, I saw no calculation there. Only exhaustion. And grief. Not grief for losing status or appearances or the spectacle of a failed engagement. Real grief. The kind that comes when illusion dies and leaves truth standing in its place. I loved you, he said quietly. It would have been easy to reject that. To tell him he'd loved the idea of me. To correct him. To win. But age teaches something younger people rarely understand. Truth is often layered. And people can love badly while still loving sincerely. I know, I said. His shoulders loosened slightly, as if some hidden tension had finally found permission to release. Then he asked the question I think he had come there dreading most. When did you know? The answer arrived easily. At your parents' dinner. He nodded once unsurprised. The Latin. Yes. He swallowed. I've replayed that moment all weekend. The wind stirred dry leaves around our shoes. His voice dropped lower. When you answered me, I realized I'd never once asked who you really were before me. There it was. The heart of it. Not cruelty exactly. Neglect. A subtler failure and in many ways a sadder one. He had loved the Claire who fit neatly into his world. The composed woman beside him at events. The elegant professor who reflected well on him. The mystery he could display. He had never paused long enough to meet the full person standing inside all that quietness. And because he had not looked deeply, he had mistaken depth for emptiness. I'm sorry, he said. No polish. No cleverness. Just 2 words offered plainly. And because they were real, I believed them. Thank you. His eyes searched mine. Not for rescue. For understanding. I thought confidence meant always being the smartest person in the room. I smiled faintly. That's insecurity wearing expensive tailoring. A soft laugh escaped him. Real this time. He shook his head. You always did speak like a classified report. That's years of government service. That earned another quiet laugh. Then his expression gentled. You frightened me, Claire. The admission startled us both. He saw it and continued. Not because of your intelligence, because you never needed anything from me. There was the final truth. At last fully visible. So many people build relationships on negotiated dependency. Need becomes reassurance. Control becomes intimacy. But I had never needed Ethan to complete me, validate me, or steady me. I had wanted him. And to someone insecure enough, wanting can feel terrifyingly fragile compared to need. You could have walked away at any moment, he said. Yes. And I hated knowing that. I nodded. I know. He looked toward the chapel spire rising pale against the November sky. Then he said very softly, You were the first person I couldn't impress into loving me. There was no self-pity in it. Only discovery. And because I understood what it had cost him to say that, I answered honestly. You never needed to impress me, Ethan. He closed his eyes briefly. A long breath left him. When he opened them again, something had changed. Acceptance. Not peace, not yet. But the first step toward it. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. My engagement ring. He held it out. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I shook my head. Keep it. He looked surprised. Why? Because someday when this hurts less, it may remind you of something worth learning. He studied me, then nodded slowly and slipped it back into his pocket. No argument. No performance. Just understanding. At last. We stood there another moment, 2 people sharing the strange tenderness that sometimes survives where romance cannot. Then Ethan gave a small smile. Goodbye, Claire. Goodbye, Ethan. He turned and walked slowly down King George Street, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders bowed, not by defeat but by thought. I watched until he disappeared beyond the old stone wall. Then I turned toward my office. Winter arrived fully a few weeks later. The semester ended. Life settled into its steady rhythms. I taught. I read. I walked the harbor at dusk beneath bare trees and sharp salt air. And on Christmas Eve, a package arrived at my front door. No return address, but I knew immediately who had sent it. Inside was an old leather-bound Latin text, its pages softened by decades of use. Richard's naval annotations filled the margins in neat blue ink. Tucked inside the cover was a single handwritten note. To someone who understood silence better than any of us. I stood very still for a long time. Then I smiled. The next morning I carried the book to campus for my winter seminar. A student stumbled over a translation from Cicero and frowned at the page. I leaned down gently and corrected him. Outside the classroom window, snow drifted softly across the old brick paths of Annapolis. Quiet. Patient. Falling without hurry. And standing there surrounded by young voices learning old truths, I thought about all the ways life humbles us into becoming ourselves.